been quite a series, I think. It's been quite good. Today we have, first of all, just to acknowledge the Manapuma people who are the custodians of this land. Back to you, Simon. Yeah, so today we do have Catriona speaking to us today. She was awarded her PhD last year, 2020. Yes, and she's published numerous articles on her PhD research, and last week received the prize, second prize, from the Chinese Studies Association in Australia to the 2021 Best PhD Thesis. So, now she is the Forrest Prospect Fellow at UWA. She's the manager for research and engagement at the UWA SAGE Lab. But I think today she is going to be talking about the Chinese migration. Thank you.
Can we mute this one so I can you hear me clearly now, Sam? How does that sound? Can people online hear me okay? Yeah, excellent. Okay, so thank you everyone. This is the third time now that I've spoken about my PhD research in this Anthropology and Sociology seminar series at UWA. Probably the last time, I guess, since next time, as Dorinda pointed out, I'll probably be talking about migrant workers in aged care, which is my new project with the SAGE Lab, the Social Care and Aging Living Lab, that's funded by the Forrest Research Foundation. But today, it's my PhD, so that's fun. The paper I'm presenting today is a mashup of two papers. One, which is currently in press, a chapter in a really excellent volume edited by Shanti Robertson and Rosie Roberts the book's called Migrants in Between, Rethinking Privilege and Social Mobility in Middle-Class Migration. And the chapter is The Class Frustrations of Middling Migrants from China in Australia. Suja Discourse meets the neoliberal logics of selective migration policies. And the second paper that's sort of mixed up together with this is one that's it'll be submitted for review next week after I've had all of your inputs. And it's called National Class Frames in Motion, Negotiating the Contradictory and Transgressive Class Mobilities of Chinese Migrants in Australia. And between the two, I plan to outline for you one of the core arguments from my thesis. This is the concept of national class frames in motion, which is a conceptual lens that I hope goes some way to bringing class into migration and migration into class. One that illustrates the diverse ways that first-generation migrants interpret their own intra-ethnic class positions, as well as the positions of others around them, through the lens of homeland national class maps and class discourses, while simultaneously contesting and changing the meanings of those nationally bounded class frames as they move with them through new transnational contexts. Okay, so this is a house in Canning Vale in the south of Perth, and I don't actually know who lives there, haven't got a clue. I found this picture on realestate.com.au, but I do know someone who lives in a house like this. In fact, he owns 3 houses, and I'm going to begin with his story, because we all like a story, and then move on to some of the theory. Okay, so David is a landlord with a couple of investment properties in the southern suburbs of Perth. Managing these properties is no small task, he says. You have to maintain them, you have to pay rates and deal with the local council, you have to manage your relationships with the neighbours. And he says that this can be a massive hassle and only really worth it for the tax breaks, the negative gearing that property owners in Australia may access to offset the costs of their investment. Rather than renting out the whole house, he lets out individual rooms to other migrants from China on flexible and often short-term leases. Among his tenants, I met a young couple from central China, both enrolled in postgraduate study at a local university and sleeping in a converted living room right next to the kitchen. I met a middle-aged civil engineer who formerly worked for a large state-owned enterprise in Guangzhou, but now operates a newsagent in a Perth mall, and a welder from the Dongbei region in northeast China who rents 2 small rooms in a shared house for himself, his wife, and his young family. So they're an unlikely set of housemates, people quite different in their occupational, educational, and regional backgrounds. David himself is also a pretty unlikely landlord. His early life gave few clues that he might one day manage an Australian property portfolio. So David was born in the late 1970s in a village in Shandong province, so small that even a few decades later, you couldn't access it, you could only access it by motorbike because there wasn't a road big enough to get a truck or a car down it. You can picture the kind of place I'm talking about. Once he became an adult, he, like many young men of his generation, particularly rural young men of his generation, left the village to seek employment in manufacturing hubs far from home. By the time he turned 30, he was an experienced welder working in the southern city of Shenzhen. From there, he joined the ever-growing numbers of Chinese skilled laborers leaving their poorly paid jobs to undertake fixed-term contracts on temporary visas in locations across the region, places like Japan, Korea, Singapore, or in David's case, here in Australia. So arriving in 2006, David came to Australia in a really exceptional moment in Perth's history. Most of us who live here know there was a resources supercycle driven by investment and a construction boom in mining, oil and gas, which transformed the economy and the demography of Western Australia during the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Between 2001 and 2011, for example, the population of metropolitan Perth grew by 30%. And those of us who lived here and experienced that, I came during part of that boom, so I didn't see it, but I'm sure many of you did. As both domestic and international migrants flocked to the city to take up lucrative roles in these sectors. Skill shortages were most acute in trade occupations, leading employers to engage migration intermediaries to recruit skilled tradesmen from across the globe. And David was part of this mass recruitment program, one of hundreds of Chinese welders brought to Perth under employment-sponsored temporary migration programs. But within 3 years, David had a permanent visa, a secure, well-paid job, and he could bring his wife over to join him. Now they're a family of 4. They have a comfortable life way beyond his imaginings when he was a boy growing up in the fields of 1980s Shandong. Others have followed in his footsteps as more and more tradesmen from his home region found sponsored employment in Perth during the boom years. However, not all of the trade-skilled migrants were so fortunate. David came to Perth at the precise point in time when it was relatively easy to secure permanent residency. Others arrived just a handful of years later and encountered a changed economic landscape, employers much less willing to sponsor people for PR, and, importantly, changed visa regulations requiring a far higher standard of English than David was required to demonstrate. So most of these later arrivals borrowed heavily to avoid broker fees, to secure employment and a visa, and the risks of those debt finance migrations for them generally outweighed the benefits. A lot of them experienced really difficult conditions and precarity as a result of those migrations. So one day over lunch, David was talking about these other migrants, telling everyone how hard it is to be a trade-skilled worker in Australia, telling me I needed to write in my research report how tough it is for all these people who've come to Perth. His tenant, the engineer turned shopkeeper, smiled wryly and observed that David was doing all right for himself, wasn't he? David paused and he looked at him, but he didn't respond directly. And in that brief moment, the room crackled with the unspoken tensions, reflecting the strangeness of that situation. The fact is that migration to Australia has created more opportunities for people from middle class and working class backgrounds from China to interact in their daily intimate lives. While in China, people from such diverse backgrounds may have had little reason to interact because they typically would have worked in different places, lived in different compounds, sent their children to different schools. In Australia, they're thrown together by ethnic concentrations in certain suburbs, through the ethnic rental market, and the commonality of a shared language in a strange land. These class differences are brought into further sharp relief because of the exceptional circumstances under which these migrants came to Perth. The resources boom in Western Australia and the great demand for skilled labour that I just mentioned produced what Martin Forsey, hi Martin, calls blue-collar affluence that subverted traditional class hierarchies based on educational attainment and professional qualifications. So these differences in structure and economy that Chinese migrants encountered in Perth during this period served to challenge and even to reverse much of the economic dimensions of class privilege that were found in the Chinese setting. Urban factory workers, even some rural labourers who once lived in dirty, cramped accommodation, struggling to earn a living wage in the big cities of China, now own Australian investment properties, and they lease rooms to the educated professionals who might have barely glanced their way back home. So that vignette is taken from my broader PhD thesis, which was titled Unlikely Settlers in Exceptional Times, and is an ethnography of trade-skilled migrants, welders, metal machinists, mechanics who were recruited from China directly to WA during the resources boom. They came as temporary labour migrants, but they've typically become permanent residents, at least the ones who arrived earlier. And they're usually still working in those skilled occupations. Their wives, meanwhile, work in more unskilled occupations, particularly peri-urban farms. A lot of them work in a mushroom farm in Catriona, south of Perth, but also food processing, packing, cleaning services, these kinds of occupations. So the primary visa applicants, and sometimes the secondary visa applicants too, have strong trade skills, but generally low academic attainment. Some have completed senior high school, some have not, and most of them have poor or very poor English. They're typically from North China, Liaoning, Shandong, Henan, these sorts of provinces, and they come from urban backgrounds, from the big industrial cities, but a lot of them also come from rural backgrounds. So they're village people who've migrated to the larger cities and then on to Australia. They're also typically a bit older, they're middle-aged and usually married with children. Most of them were in their 30s or even their 40s when they first came to Australia. So they're sort of an older cohort to be migrating for the first time. So the presence, I guess, just to emphasize the point of working class labourers and their families in Perth complicates the class landscape of Chinese Australia, which has, at least for the last 40 years, tended to be middle class and tertiary educated, particularly when so many of them enjoyed material success during the mining boom. So the subversion of homeland class hierarchies leads to contested class positions in the receiving country context. So in order to adequately account for the changing meaning social class can have for migrants who are moving through time and space, this paper proposes national class frames in motion as a new lens to inform analyses of transnational migration and transnational lives. Okay, so this is like all the theory from my PhD, so I'm trying to make it shorter, and I hope I've picked the right bits to make sense in the space of such a short presentation. We'll give it a go. Class has generally been underrepresented in recent work in the field of migration studies. Now, that's not to say it's been absent, but it has been underemphasized, certainly in comparison with other sites of identity like gender or ethnicity or race or religion. Nicholas von Heer has called for a fresh engagement with the concept, saying that scholars should seek to understand how class, which he understands as a possession of various species of capital, so like a Bourdieusian approach to class, influences opportunities, decisions, routes and destinations throughout the migration process. And he says, this is a quote, that the form of migration and its outcomes are shaped by resources, economic or network-based, that would-be migrants can muster. The capacity to mobilize these resources is largely dependent on determined by socioeconomic background or class. There's me fluffing the most important part of the quote. Largely determined by socioeconomic background or class. Holding combinations of such capital shapes the routes would-be migrants can take and the channels they can follow, the destinations they can reach, and the life chances that they have afterwards. And there's an emerging literature that engages with this capitals-based approach. So in the context of migration regimes that increasingly emphasize skilled migration over unskilled labor migration or family migration, we can see that states, selective migration policies are the mechanisms whereby states can validate and credentialize various forms of capital. That can be work experience, qualifications, even English language skills, which, although they can be a reflection of nationality or ethnicity, are equally more easily acquired by people who have the resources to access and to pay for education. So migrants, therefore, mobilize what Kim has called migration facilitating capital, which can involve all of these dimensions, or mobility capital, to borrow from Scheller, in order to navigate these increasingly complex and demanding selective migration regimes. So, however, while social class and the resultant resources individual migrants can mobilize undoubtedly affects the migration trajectories of people from all national backgrounds, an analysis based on the individualized capitals of migrants and their engagement with selective migration policies is not quite enough to understand the varied and complex ways that class features in the lives of first-generation migrants. So in order to respond to the gaps, I've come up with this concept of national class frames to explore dimensions of class in transnational contexts, particularly in relation to intra-ethnic or co-ethnic class. So co-ethnic class is something that really has been lacking from the migration literature. Some work looking at inequality through migration, but looking at it from a co-ethnic lens and looking at that intersection between class and ethnicity is something that's really only starting to happen now. So Wu and Liu link the advent of transnational theories that privilege ethnic ties as a site of analysis with what they call the dearth of class analysis in the growing body of literature on immigration. So a preoccupation with the activities and processes that create complex networks and links between homelands and destinations can, Wu and Liu say, result in analyses that assume ethnic homogeneity and overlook the material inequalities that are necessarily embedded in these global and transnational frames. The relative absence of class in Australian ethnicity literature over the last 3 decades, I think, may similarly have much to do with multiculturalism and the way it's been constructed and the way multicultural policy has been implemented. Because by emphasizing symbolic relationships, symbolic representations of diversity and relying on aggregated or even essentialized ethnic groups in the allocation of resources and common sense understandings of how multiculturalism works, this runs the risk again of obscuring or erasing that kind of intra-ethnic difference that is clearly there. Earlier Australian analyses, and when I say earlier, I mean like 40 years ago, did address the relationship between ethnicity and class, but they focused typically on ethnic disadvantage and issues of equity for minorities. So proceeding from the position that immigration policy is a function of Australian capitalism, they tend to focus, and they're in the real Marxist tradition, obviously, 40 years ago, on the fault line between class as it divides ethnic and racial minorities from the dominant white Anglo-Celtic majority. And of course, that's a good point. And there's a huge literature that continues with that racial inequality perspective, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Instead, I'm less concerned with the relationship and the class relations between people of different ethnicity races. I'm seeking to understand differences of experience and perspective originating in social class between people, between migrants of the same ethnicity and the same nationality. So coming back to Wu and Liu, they emphasize the importance of bringing class back into analyses of co-ethnic employment and exploitation, and they're part of a small but growing body of literature that does just that. However, while Wu and Liu's emphasis on relational economic class is refreshing, it presents only one aspect of intra-ethnic class, seen through the dynamics of production and employment. But of course, class is also expressed, contested, and negotiated in other migrant settings, like co-ethnic rental markets, we just heard about that, schools, public places of consumption and of business. And these expressions involve symbolic and cultural dimensions of class. Class continues to be produced, reproduced, and contested in migration since, following Bourdieu, classes exist not as ontological formations of people, fixed groups, but rather as practices of group making and remaking. By considering what Antheus calls the translocational positions of migrants, thinking about them in space and in social hierarchies, it becomes clear that despite spatial movements across borders, habitus is stable and it changes slowly, resulting in what Schwartz calls the reproduction of common patterns of hierarchy and conflict from one field to another. So things don't change easily. Migrants may find themselves in a new field, in a new place, but their opportunities for drastically remaking their habitus or transforming their position within co-ethnic class hierarchies are limited, to be honest. Homeland national class frames therefore remain a site of social distance between migrants of the same nationality in receiving country contexts. And this has been looked at by other people, like Gold has looked at it among Israelis in London, and Oliver and O'Reilly look at Brits in Spain and Brits in France. So there's similar patterns found elsewhere. Looking at Australia then, very few Australian studies have considered these intra-ethnic dimensions of class, and those that have address class only between different migration waves. So people who came to Australia at different points in time under different political and economic conditions. So for example, Balthazar Pike and Ben Mush look at Vietnamese who came under humanitarian programs in the 70s and 80s versus newer middle-class Vietnamese migrants. So it's that kind of distance across time, very, very different circumstances surrounding their migrations. In my work, I aim to go beyond these analyses by demonstrating that even among migrant groups identified as sharing common nationality, language, and migration wave, the same vintage or generation, national class frames transposed into transnational contexts may generate significantly different processes of migration and settlement and other expressions of intra-ethnic class. Okay, we got there in the end. So this is where I bring in my idea around national class frames in motion. So much of the theorizing of social class has been conducted with reference to nationally bounded populations. It tends to be looking at class structures, class analyses tend to happen within the bounded space of the nation, and have done since really the beginning of social class as a body of theoretical literature, way back. However, just because it's nationally bounded as a concept, generally nationally bounded as a concept, this doesn't mean it's not applicable or useful in migration studies, nor, I'd say, is it methodological nationalism. Rather, I argue it's a sensitive attendance to the ways that the national continues to have relevance in the lives of people who are living transnationally. National class frames are naturalized in social theory, and more importantly, they're naturalized in migrants' own constructions of their social worlds. The experiences of the participants in my study suggest that national class frames continue to have meaning for migrants as they move. These same frames continue to have meaning, so before they move, but these same frames continue to have meaning, though that meaning can be challenged and transformed during and after their movements across borders. So national class frames are transported, reformed, and reinterpreted by transnational migrants in their new contexts. Reinserting national frames into manifestations of class in transnational contexts, as I say, provides new insights into co-ethnic or intra-ethnic class contestations. And I think this works particularly well with reference to Chinese migration, because in China, and I haven't got time to go into this in any great detail, but I could at another time, because in China, mobility, spatial mobility and the movement across space, whether it's domestic or international, is deeply imbricated with culturalist dimensions of class, and the ways that Chinese national class frames construct mobility and migration as either something desirable, something to be emulated, as in the case of international migration or the migration of some people to Chinese cities, or something transgressive that needs to be controlled, as in the case of rural migration to the cities within China. So there are already spatial dimensions to Chinese national class frames before we even start looking at it here in Australia. Okay, let's get back to some stories then. So the employment conditions that migrants in China encountered in boom-time Perth served to invert many of both the material and cultural dimensions of occupational class that were established under PRC national class frames. Welders and other tradesmen whose manual labour in China had been poorly paid and also culturally undervalued found that in Perth they were not only high earners, and I mean high earners, some of them were making $110,000, $120,000 working 5-hour roles, like crazy money compared to what they were getting before. So they were not only high earners, but they were also respected as tradies, you know, legendary cultural figures of Western Australia. This was a huge shift in the way that they felt they'd been perceived. At the same time, many tertiary educated migrants from China have experienced de-skilling through migration, sometimes marginalized at home and abroad by not because they can't find work that's commensurate to their employment. And so they also have to navigate, experience de-skilling while also navigating tenuous legal status, as they often move through a series of temporary visas without necessarily securing permanent residency. On the whole, I found middle-class migrants, tertiary educated migrants, are not taking this very well. The presence of less educated and perhaps through some frames less worthy co-nationals living in Perth is perceived as transgressive. That people like David, who grew up in the village and didn't even complete senior high school, have now taken Australian citizenship, bought a house, established a family here in Perth, that he and others like him have material success way beyond that of many de-skilled tertiary graduates, is a direct challenge to the homeland national class frames. So this is a quote typical of many conversations I had with middle-class migrants whose homeland class discourse of suja, which is like the embodied disposition or the innate quality of a person, and the habits of other migrants were invoked as problematic. So this person says, migrants have changed because before you had to have a certain level of education to go abroad. Now I see low quality people behaving badly, especially older people of 30 to 50 years old. She's talking about, we know who she's talking about, right? For example, they behave badly because they say they can't read the road signs. I have a parking space behind the shop and I have to use it to get to work on time, but often people park in it, even though there's a sign. So I park behind them, which is blocking them in, and I leave my business card on the windscreen so they can call me when they come back. One day I blocked in a car, and when the driver came back, he didn't see my card and started kicking my car. Fortunately, my neighbour saw him and called me, and we went out and asked him to stop. But it's this kind of behaviour that I mean. And this is sort of typical of the kind of language that I repeatedly heard from tertiary educated migrants talking about low quality, invoking the language of homeland national class discourses, talking about low quality migrants with poor education as a threat to integration, as a problem for the Chinese community as a whole. Working class migrants, meanwhile, are well aware of how the middle class migrants in Perth discuss them. Sam is a welder in his mid-30s and comparatively uneducated, having worked in a factory since he turned 18. However, since he arrived in Perth in 2007 and enjoyed full employment throughout the boom years, his trade skills have served him well. When I met him in 2015, he had a lucrative fly-in, fly-out role with the resources company, so he hadn't been laid off at the end of the mining boom, and he was still making loads of coin. He was very dismissive of the sense of superiority so common among more highly educated migrants. Sam argued that different economic conditions and occupational opportunities in Australia challenged the class relations that previously structured their interactions in China. And I'll read his quote as well. He says, "The difference between us and the white-collar migrants and the foreign students is that they think they're better, but we're in the better situation. A foreign student comes here and has to spend so much on fees, and then they have their living costs on top of that. They can only work 20 hours a week, and then only in low-paying jobs like cleaning. In 4 years, they spend the same amount that we earn. We also have a higher status here. In China, a worker has a comparatively low status, but in Australia, a worker is a good thing to be. A plumber or welder or mechanic is a good job and can make money. They think they're better because they're well educated and speak good English, but who has the good job? Who has bought a house and a car, maybe a boat?" He was pretty explicit there, isn't he? Maybe we're all doing the wrong thing. It's not too late to go and sign up at SAGE, is it? Migrants who are employed in trade-skilled occupations, interestingly, similarly interpret local interactions with other co-ethnic tradesmen and their families through the prism of homeland national class frames. So here I'm talking about circumstances where socio-spatial expressions of class are the most significant. Are certainly the sites that participants frequently identify and invoke, noting the differences that they perceive between migrants from urban centres, people who were born and have hukou, residency rights in the big cities, and those originally from rural parts of China, people like David. So I've got a couple of quotes here from a welder and a welder's wife, so they're not from the same family. They're both from provincial capitals in the north of China, really big cities, and they both worked for big state and enterprise work units before moving to Australia. So one guy said, I didn't want to buy in an area where lots of Chinese live. This is because they, meaning working class migrants who come from rural areas, think differently and so behave differently. They are from the village and they have no education. They haven't even completed junior middle school, and they've been at work in the field since they were 15. It's not really about their sudra, their embodied cultural capital, or their quality, to translate directly, but he says your environment influences your thinking. The way you feel about migration, about Australia, depends a lot on where you come from in China. I'm from Shenyang. Many migrants are from the countryside, from Shandong or Sichuan. They were farmers, and then they came to the cities as rural migrant labor, so they think differently. Another person that she said, she was telling me about how hard it was for her to migrate. She told me this very long story about it. It was a really difficult process. So she told me all about the challenges of migrating and coming to Australia and finding her feet in a strange land. And then she said, but for people from the country, it's better here than it is for me. From their teenage years, they have to leave their homes and go work in developed cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai. They work as the rural migrant laborers, and they're used to physical work. They used to have to work here, work there, 1 year in one place, another year in another place. So when they come here to Australia, they feel like they've found paradise. The work is the same for them. People who have been rushed all over from pillar to post for work will feel better when they're here and they can stay in the one place. So these are kind of representative of the things I was told repeatedly by people from urban backgrounds in China. They said that the way you're from, the place that you're from within China, and your rural versus urban upbringing significantly influences the way you feel about migration. And this is a narrative that I heard again and again and again from lots of different participants. So, to conclude, the cohort of migrants, both urban and rural, whose experiences inform the arguments I'm presenting here, are from working class backgrounds in China, and their presence in Australia is at root the result of temporary labour migration. However, such a neat description is problematic since working class encompasses a broad range of Chinese subjectivities, and binaries of temporary permanence and the categories of student labour, visitor, family migration that we use in official administration here are porous, and empirical realities are, in fact, much more messy. Furthermore, although these trade-skilled migrants from China to Australia are capital constrained and they articulate their motivations for temporary labour migration primarily in economic terms, they are still, like their more privileged co-nationals, subject to the same cultural imaginaries that valorize mobility and the figure of the overseas Chinese citizen. So they're part of those same national class discourses and national mobility frames. Labour migrants and lifestyle migrants are perhaps not so easily disambiguated, and the accounts presented in this study demonstrate how these subjectivities coexist and overlap in ways that are heavily inflected by social class. Nonetheless, the members of this cohort are different from most contemporary Chinese migrants to Australia. They really are unusual and unlikely settlers. Their experiences are undoubtedly conditioned by their nationality, their ethnicity, their race, and their language, and these are intersecting factors that I address in my arguments. But by foregrounding the class dimensions of their migration and settlements, I present a fresh perspective on the story of Chinese people in Australia, and importantly, progress towards rethinking theories of class and migration to account for the complex, varied, and highly particular effects that social class, and particularly national class frames in motion, manifests in the lives of international migrants living transnational lives. So I propose national class frames in motion as a way of conceptualizing the centrality of homeland class to first-generation migrants' experiences. Transnational meanings of class need to be interpreted through the lens of nationally bounded class frames. This re-evaluation of the importance of homeland class is in part a response to the critiques of methodological nationalism, because while transnational approaches to migration studies alleviate the paradigms of the past, to abandon nationally class-framed analyses loses a really central dimension of the migrant experience. Thank you. We need to change the headphones now and do it. Turn this one off and turn that one on.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm thinking in terms of how much of this is Chinese migrants in Australia. I'm thinking of doing sort of two reasons. First, the Chinese state, especially recently, the establishment of the national frames, Chinese national frames here to do with the way in which the Chinese state-sponsored associations in Australia are themselves organised and so on. But I'm also thinking through the other way around that it seems to me the Australian national immigration regimes are peculiarly focused on class and always have been, going back to the origins of the kind of modern nation, obviously mostly out of the UK and Ireland. You know, the £10 poems and the stories of, you know, lining up on the quayside, depending on what type of hat you had, whether you were classified as working class or middle class, very socialised. The working class in South Australia sent off to camps with the Nissan huts and Salisbury, the town which was built just from working class Brits and so on. So to what extent do those Australian kind of models of class and migration establish themselves on other ethnic groups who move here as well? My sort of other question is about the frame in general, national class frames. I sort of wonder about its generalisability for other national groups where maybe class is not such a strong kind of analytical category. I'm thinking, for example, South Sudanese, where it's difficult to really think about it's really difficult to think about class as a useful category for understanding South Sudanese, to be honest with you. And so, you know, what sort of challenge do those communities pose? Thank you.
Thank you. There's just a question that I couldn't hear, so can you just repeat? Not repeat all questions.
What I might do is the sound okay if I turn my headset on, or are you getting lots of sound? Yeah? Thanks, Katie. I may not try and repeat everything Richard just said, but maybe I'll draw upon it in turn and as I respond. So, Richard asked about how this approach may be specific to Chinese in Australia, and asked about the Chinese state being increasingly interventionist in relation to overseas diasporas, and whether the re-establishment of national class frames among Chinese migrants in Australia is related to state sponsorship of community organisations and the like. Perhaps media would be a factor there as well. So in response to that, yes, the Chinese state is increasingly interventionist in relation to its overseas diasporas. However, in terms of community organisations in Australia, very few of the trade-skilled migrants that I work with have anything to do with community organisations in Australia whatsoever. The main reason for that, I think, is that they work so hard. They are often working 6 days a week during the boom. Many of them are working 6-7 days a week. They haven't got time to be part of community organisations or political activities. However, they are still very much engaged with homeland discourses, whether related to class or otherwise. They are all simultaneously engaged with people in China from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed. They're on WeChat from morning to night, as are their more educated co-nationals. So to what extent the way that class is interpreted by more privileged and less privileged migrants from China to Australia is inflected by state-led discourses. I just have to look into how those class discourses within China are being structured. There is a body of work looking at this idea of suja as the embodied form of cultural capital that is widely understood as differentiating the middle class from everybody else. And there are two schools of thought. One argues that it's a top-down attempt to create a new neoliberal model for individualized personal responsibility within China. Others argue it's a much more grassroots response, and that these discourses around embodied cultural capital are a reaction to the state-led shift towards more capitalist relations of production. So is it to do with state intervention? Is it to do with being plugged into Chinese homeland discourses that are both moving in all directions at all time? I'm not sure. It would be interesting to find out. Question 2 from Richard was, Australian migration regimes have often been quite focused on class. He spoke about the classification of British migrants, whether they're wearing a cap or a more middle-class hat. I don't know what you call one of those ones, but a bowler and the one at the front, I don't know what that means. The hat measure in British class. I'm not sure when we think about other migrants of other ethnicities to Australia that Australian migration has historically been particularly focused on class. If we look at the people who were actively recruited to come to Australia in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, they tend to be from working class backgrounds across Southern and Eastern Europe. And there isn't that strong differentiation among, that strong class differentiation among that cohort, those generations of migrants. What is interesting is the way Val College Paiska has a really great paper called Working Class Ethnics to the Multicultural Middle Class. And she talks about how all of these people from Southern and Eastern Europe were predominantly working class, often from rural backgrounds, but some from the cities as well. However, over time, the second and third generations have shifted into what is very much a more middle class habitus and middle class occupational and educational practices. At the same time, skilled migration, which really commences from the late 1980s onwards, means that new migrants coming to Australia tend to be actively selected through migration regimes that privilege middle class credentials and middle class qualities like tertiary education, professional qualifications, and the like. But I don't think that's uniquely Australian. There's been a wide shift in the global north towards introducing migration policies that privilege the migration of people with these kinds of credentials, with these kinds of capitals. It's the same in Europe. And in Europe, it's even more extreme because in Europe, very often partner migration is also linked to being able to demonstrate particular, not class-based credentials, but certainly economic credentials. You have to have an income over a certain level in order to allow your partner to move to live with you in Belgium and in Britain, and I think in some other places too that I can't remember off the top of my head. So that it's not, I don't think it's uniquely Australian. I think this could have application in other global north contexts as well. And finally, generalizability of national class frames for other national groups that don't necessarily have class as a differentiating site of identity in their home countries. The example you gave was South Sudanese, about whom I know nothing at all, so can't comment on that one. I'm really interested in extending this and applying it to other national groups. Obviously, I would be fascinated to see how it works with British migrants. Anyone who's been to Mindarie can see that there is something there around homeland national class frames and distinction in Perth. I expect it has application across many different national and ethnic groups, but it would need clearly tweaking and adapting, because that's the point of a national frame applied in transnational context, but maybe not with certain groups that don't have that same level of class differentiation back home. Thank you, Richard.
Two questions. You mentioned early on in the presentation that many of you before very poor English. I'm wondering about the language you used in your work. Was it always Mandarin? Were there certain people who wanted to switch into English? And did that have any relationship to their perceptions of their own class? They did. So, you know, sort of something linguistics of the field encounter. The second question, from the next to last quotation you gave, where the person identified as from Shenyang and was rather denigrating attitude from those from Shandong or Sichuan. Could you elaborate a little bit more how class articulates with regional identity? Is it mainly that some regions are seen as more rural and thus lower to others, or are there other dimensions by way, you know, having to do with attribution of different sorts of sushi in body class practice on a regional basis, and then how that particularly links to class perceptions? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Did everybody hear those questions? Maybe on the, yes, excellent, thanks, Sam. Okay, so the sociolinguistics of the field encounter. So yeah, everyone from the trade skilled migrants cohort had poor or very poor English. Some had developed better language skills through working here for several years, but most had not, and continued to certainly socialize in entirely Sinophone environments. All of my interviews and conversations with all of that cohort were entirely in Mandarin. Occasionally might use the odd phrase in English. David, when he was telling me about his co-workers, his Aussie, local Australian co-workers, would quote them, and every time he used an expletive, he would say that in English. I probably shouldn't say it here now, but he talked about their very colourful language that they used in the workshop as they were welding. How did that affect their, it's a very tricky one to ask, because there wasn't that, I think my position as someone who looks like a local Australian, even if I'm not really, may have had some impact on the way that class dimensions were articulated. People would say things like, oh, you know what local Australians are like? Oh, maybe not the highly educated ones like you, but the ones that like a drink on a Friday. And I didn't say I like a drink on a Friday too. Probably not helpful. But there was definitely my class position. It's not really about sociolinguistics, but it's certainly about my positionality in the field. My class position certainly had an impact on the ways that these conversations emerged. Some of my participants, half my participants were from trade school backgrounds. Some of my participants, as you can see, were also from more middle class, tertiary educated backgrounds. I think it was with them that my class position was particularly useful in drawing out these conversations around what they thought about the others. And I, yeah, in my methods chapter, I have a bit I write at length about how the various dimensions of me, but particularly my class position and my position as a migrant, led to these insights. So I think if I hadn't had my own middle class occupation, they all talked about me as a university teacher, even though I was a casual tutor at the time, but that framed who I was to them. Again, that was particularly with the less well-educated participants. Okay, Shenyang and Shandong and Sichuan, so regional identities and class. So I think there is, while there are strong regional identities in China and a lot of stereotyping around what different regions are like and the characteristics of people from different places, at the same time there is this kind of middle class Chinese habitus that's linked to language again. It's about the ability to articulate yourself well in Mandarin and to have like a very standard pronunciation that sort of operates at a more of a national level. Shenyang is in Liaoning province in the northeast of China. It's the part of China where standard pronunciation comes from. So they already have that everyone has that kind of that linguistic advantage, if you like, although they do have strong accents up there as well. It's like the Geordies of China, but maybe not such a strong voice. And it's a part of China that was industrialized throughout the communist period, and indeed before. A lot of the original industrial infrastructure was built by the Japanese, and so there's this kind of there's more of a sense of being the established workers of China, in the sense of the communist framing of the established workers of China among the people who live in those big cities in the north. Prior to the reform period, being a worker was a very good thing to be in China. And since the early 1980s, particularly through into the 1990s, workers from big northern cities have experienced a drastic reduction in their materialist class positions within China, widening of the gap between rich and poor, and they haven't been on the winning side of that. And also a loss of that kind of culturalist position, that cultural class position as a worker, the vanguard of the revolution. There's always been tensions between the urban and the rural and country bumpkins, this kind of typification of people from the country as less educated and lesser. The same sort of thing happens in lots of other national contexts. Shandong and Sichuan, even though they do have large cities with large middle class populations, do have a bit of a reputation for being more rural and more bumpkiny in some places. And interestingly, and I don't actually know why this is, I suspect it's to do with migration intermediaries. The people in Perth from Shandong and from Sichuan tend to be, certainly the welders in Perth from Shandong and Sichuan tend to be from the country, whereas the welders from the northeast tend to be from the cities. This is to do with migration intermediaries, now that I think about it, because people from Shandong and Sichuan were already domestic labor migrants within China. They'd left their villages and they'd gone to particularly Shenzhen and Guangzhou down in the southwest, and it was there that they met the migration brokers that would facilitate their introductions to Australian employers and process the paperwork needed for them to exit China and enter Australia on temporary work visas. Because Shenyang is an industrial heartland, there was a migration intermediary business, industry, I'm trying to find a word here, but there were lots of migration intermediaries already in Shenyang. So people were able to go from Shenyang working in big factories straight to Australia without having to go through that preliminary move to other urban centres in China as domestic migrant workers. Okay.
Martin, who's going to ask the question?
We'll have to turn the sound on, won't we?
How's that coming through? Can you hear? No. People online can hear, but not in the room, hey? That's how it looks.
I can hear you through my headset, Martin.
Okay. Okay. Well, I guess I'll just go with it that way. And thanks, Kath. That's really interesting in all sorts of ways, and it's always good to have a good rigorous discussion about social class, which happens all too infrequently, I think. I was thinking about, as you were talking about a paper that was in Ethnic and Migration Studies some years ago that I drew upon, that talked about the lack of attention to middling sorts in migration studies. So a tendency to focus at the poles, at the elite and the lower class exploited workforces of kind of global mobility. And then a paper published by Kincaid, I think, helps contribute to that in terms of thinking about two forms of class categorization going on at the same time. So there's a tendency to focus at the poles, so more Marxist dichotomy, and then thinking more about the fluid middle, which is where that's obviously where your focus seems to be here, and I think it often is, but obviously not in migration studies, seems to be one of the claims. And then I was also thinking about, in this middling mobilities space in which you're thinking that you're working, that idea of the blue collar affluence, and I was writing out in the context of what I see as that upsetting that modernist myth of educational meritocracy, that education-based meritocracy, and I think that discourse is really evident in what you're saying there. I mean, in what the people that you interviewed are saying. They're actually basing a lot of their judgment of others on education. So, that's it seems to me to be one of the key markers in that middling class analysis. I've got then two questions coming out of that. One is about, that national homeland class idea that you've got there. It seemed to me that it didn't sound very different to the Australian version of class discourse, particularly in that sort of middling space that, education plays such a strong role, the levels of qualification, as you put it a bit earlier. So, so to what extent is the national lens useful? To what extent is it global? Is it a global class, system that we need to be thinking about here? And then my other question is about the reproduction of values going on within the space. And I think you started to touch on that before, but, amongst those affluent blue collar people that you worked with, interviewed and so on, spent time with, to what extent are they reproducing those values here in Australia? The kind of habitus, or what was it you called it, the suji? To what extent are they, I've mangled it, I'm sure, but to what extent are they doing that? Or are they buying now into that meritocratic myth of formal education?
Okay. I got that. Yeah. Can I see Richard? Okay. I'll respond, but if anyone needs to leave, then of course please do so, because this is going well over time. Oh dear, hang on, I've just turned my headphone off. Sorry, bear with me. Okay, so Martin talked about a paper in GEMS which drew attention to middling thoughts. I think you're probably talking about Conrad and Lathamson, maybe, and middling migration. Yep. Which argues that migration studies tends to focus on the poles, on the elites and the lower class exploited workforce, without paying much attention to everyone in the middle, who actually make up the vast majority of people moving, certainly nowadays, in the world. And thinking about Kincaid and class categories that apply to that sort of fluid middle, not that kind of Marxist dichotomy of the elites and the exploited workers. Yes, absolutely, and I'm really excited to be part of a new book that's coming out later this year. As I said, it's called Migrants in Between, Rethinking Privilege and Social Mobility in Middle Class Migration. And it's a really compelling volume that does exactly that. It interrogates this idea of the middle and the way that classed positions and positions of relative privilege are not fixed, and they're contingent, and they change over time, they move, and people can strategically position themselves to succeed within the particular frames that are available to them. And again, it's a comparative text. There are examples from Europe, from India, from China, from Australia in that text. And I think it really does a great deal to respond to that call to understand middling migration as an overlooked dimension of that class experience of migrants. You related to that, Martin, you talked about your book, your paper about the Karatha mentality and the blue collar affluence that arose as a result of the migration boom and the huge amount of money flowing to tradies. and how that disrupted or upset the modernist myth of education-based meritocracy. And related to that, you asked two questions. One is about, I can't read my own writing, how specific is this national class idea? Because what I was talking about in relation to China sounds quite similar to those kind of education and occupation-based ideas, class structures that exist in Australia. To what extent is it useful to think about this in national terms rather than in terms of global class? I think that's really interesting, but I think what class discourse, thank you, Martin. Class discourse is exactly it. The ways that although there are some elements of class frames that are similar across multiple different national contexts, you know, this privileging of tertiary education and educational pathways to material and social success, I think the ways that they're articulated are very different. Here in Australia, we have the myth of the egalitarian classless society, which is clearly rubbish, but it does inform the way that Australians talk about class and talk about class difference. It's very different to the explicitly discriminatory way that class discourses are articulated in China. And yes, we may talk about bogans and things like that. We do have more discriminatory language in Australia, but I think it's more good-humoured than some of the class discourses that certainly that the participants I was talking with are articulating here in Australia. So maybe we need to be thinking about it on these different scales. We can be thinking about local expressions of class. We can be thinking about national class discourses, but maybe then we need to situate them all in relation to the dimensions of class that are, I was going to say universal, but that's clearly the wrong word, that are more global and widely accepted in many different national contexts. And finally, Martin, reproduction of values, what's going on in this space? Are these class dispositions being replicated for the second, and there aren't any third generations yet, but second generation migrants from this cohort? And the short answer to that is no, they are not. The children of these trade skilled migrants are following very much the same sort of pattern as the earlier generations of working class migrants from East and Southern European countries of origin, and moving into that multicultural middle class that Val Kulch-Peisker talks about. I met, for example, I met one mechanic who was born in the frozen fields of North China and only got out by joining the army and had like the roughest, most challenging start to his life, and his daughter's currently enrolled in med here. So this kind of second and third generation, well, we don't know about the third generation yet, but that second generation mobility is going on, and the meritocratic myths of education are definitely alive and kicking, even among these working class migrants from China. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. The video needs to go through. Sam is going to be hanging around if you'd like to ask you a question.
Sure.
Hi, Sam.
Yep.
So just before you all go, next week will be hosted on Zoom because it is a team from is involved with, and so the speaker will be coming from elsewhere. So next week is probably not yet. Okay. It's
Greg.
Yeah, it's about moving beyond scientific measurements of water quality to looking at rivers as offering a sense of place and social learning. So an attempt to have an anthropological approach to the wider dimensions of identity work in citizen science, in focusing on the Catriona River in Sabah, Malaysia.
and the speaker is in Malaysia?
No, the speaker, I think she's doing the whole thing on her own.
Yeah.
There may be a little bit of participation by the rest of us. Yeah, should be did.
Hi, Sam.
So yeah, if anyone needs to go, feel free.
So is it Sam or Danao? Sam first,
Sorry, did you
and
want
then Danao.
me to ask it?
Okay.
Did you want me to ask it? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We're having some sound problems. Not yet, Sam. Oh, yes, there we go. Thanks, Fred. I'm just going to email me, sure. Do that.
Okay.
Why is the microphone not picking up questions because it used to? We don't know. No? We need to check. No, I'm actually out of the, it's not LinkedIn anymore, I can take it off. It's not doing anything. So, I don't know why.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Sam said he's going to email.
Okay, what's the cool one? Like, you mentioned what the urban previous law and I'll get that exact that one. So two short questions and comment, but the second question was sort of picking up on what you were mentioning about the vanguard and how that sort of discourse. And because I found one of the little pie and doing that confusion really interesting. I was wondering if you do that with your topic in education, beyond this education. Without flattening of class and then that was like that kind of relink it in that historical context. But the comment is, so I came to the presentation thinking, oh yeah, this probably has nothing to do with what I'm doing. And then I thought, oh my gosh, this has everything to do with what I'm doing. Because us, in a different way, this, so I was doing research on international schools, so you have the Western expat kids coming to the school, middle class, but coming with all the expat package, but they see themselves as middle class, and it's just this temporary time of almost privilege. And then they're going to school with the local elite, and the elites are, my father's a minister, my father owns a TV company and a media company, the sons and daughters of Indonesia's Reproduction of Values. And so money-wise, if it's just finances, they're way richer. And there was this whole tension. So you've got the middle class expat students and the teachers really resenting the rich local elites. But in that school context, because it's an English medium school and it's a westernized school, the middle class ones were the dominant.
Because they have that international habit.
Yeah, international habits. And so you have this tension of the middle class Western kids and the elite Indonesian kids, the boys especially, kind of competing for this top dog position. Yeah. And so just looking at this, it was like, I see the Indonesian local elites as the tradies with the money. And then you've got the middle class,
And the Japanese and Koreans middle class as well?
The Japanese and Koreans were middle class as well, however, they didn't have the cultural capital that Western kids did.
Yeah.
But the English speaking must have been, but they have the middle class.
But they have a middle class outlook.
Yeah, so they were.
But yeah, so they were part of that.
No,
In the same way. They did exactly the Indonesian.
I didn't hear it as much. It was mainly Western.
This is the international schools, right?
Sorry?
This is the international schools in Indonesia.
Yeah, so they have these like national frameworks and transnational, like it's just all clashing and intersecting. And I kind of see that in what you were
even though this is all from one national.
I know, right? So it's fine, but I do all the research if you look for it. Yeah.
Going back to the first two questions, which were, oh yeah, what do the rural people have to say? Yeah, so interestingly, the rural people, they talked a lot about how coming to Australia was, in some ways they agreed with some of the things that the urban working class was saying around life in Australia being better for them. You know, they talked about how in China it had been pretty crap being a rural migrant labourer. One of them initially went over, one of the rural migrant labourers initially went overseas to work in Japan for 4 years, and he had a lot of money, and came back to China with more money. He was able to, you know, buy a house and stuff, but he found that when he got back, he was still subject to the same oppressive national class traits. He said something like, you know, I could go to Japan and come back and make some money, but when I get back to China, I'm just a rural labourer, I'll never be anything else. My kids can never be anything else. Whereas in Australia, I have the opportunity to transcend that, and maybe my kids can have a better life here. So he was very much using migration as a tool to achieve social mobility, and really explicit about articulating that. There was a really interesting point around the difference between people from urban backgrounds and rural backgrounds. That was actually around citizenship. So people from rural backgrounds are much more likely to have taken Australian citizenship and to be determined to make a life here in Australia, because you can't be dual national, you have to give up your Chinese citizenship and all of the rights of urban belonging and all of the rights of social belonging and access to sort of resources along with it. I don't think any of the trade-skilled migrants from urban backgrounds are given up Chinese citizenship. They all wanted to hold on to it. They all valued their position in China. They wanted to possibly return to retire, and they wanted to be able to continue to access social security and healthcare, which are not available in any way to rural migrants, whether they're in the cities. So there was this definitely a difference there in the way that they articulated their experience of migration and plans for the future. I mean, trash talk. The urban migrants in the way that the urban migrants trash talk the people from rural backgrounds.
That's interesting. That's interesting. The urban workers trash talk the middle class.
Yeah, the urban workers trash talk the middle class, and the rural migrants to some extent trash talk the middle class, but not as much as the urban ones. And yeah, that's a really interesting point that I haven't fully explored. And you asked a question about sort of the history and the background, and yeah, there's a big section in my literature review where I talk about Andrew Walter wrote a paper in 1984 called The Making and the Unmaking of the Chinese Working Class, and the idea that this idea of the urban worker was actually a construct that was created that came to have real social meaning for people living in the cities of China, and then following the reforms in the 1980s, 1990s, so that loss of social position has been really challenging for many people. A lot of people who had thought they'd have, you know, not only status but also a secure job for life, have found that they were retrenched in the restructuring of the state-owned enterprises that happened in the 1990s, and their children, if they're the right generation to have children coming into the workforce, were not able to enjoy the same sorts of material or cultural dimensions of being an urban worker that people had under the socialist system, pre-reform socialist system. But I like the history bit. I think I should have been a historian, but then I like talking to people too much.
It is after 3:15, so we've well and truly extended our time.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.